So let me go first to the question of bang for the buck. In terms of economic policies we might enact now to strengthen an economy that is too weak, your analysis shows that the largest effect would arise from a temporary increase in aid to the unemployed. The next largest effect would be a temporary reduction in employers' payroll taxes. Smaller but still significant effects would come from other policies such as temporary reduction in the employees' payroll taxes, additional one-time Social Security payments, additional temporary refundable tax credits for lower and middle-income households, and going down the line, other things that would have an effect but would be still smaller would be temporary increase in investment in infrastructure. And the final option you looked at was reduction, one-year deferral of the increase in income taxes that you also found would have a positive effect, although it would be the least bang for the buck of the options analyzed. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make 2 quick points. One is that this analysis we did in January assumed that these policies would be enacted in early 2010. Of course, that's not possible at this point. We have not updated all of these estimates. One that would look somewhat different, actually, if this picture could go back up there, that would, on my screen, that would be helpful, whoever is controlling that.
Is that the slide you want?
Yes, that's the slide I have in mind. If we update the numbers now, they would change a little bit. The basic pattern wouldn't be different. But it is true that the effect of extending the tax cuts would look a little stronger because this extension was one that actually began in 2011. In other words, 1 year into the 2-year window we were focusing on at the time. And that diminished its effect a little bit. But if we updated all these numbers, that option of extending the tax cuts would still be have lower bang for the buck than almost all the options on this list. The other thing I should want to add, Mr. Chairman, is that it's important to recognize this is the effect per dollar of budgetary impact. As I mentioned in my remarks, if one wants to have an effect of a certain size on the economy, it also matters the scale at which these things are done. Some of these options can naturally be done at larger scale than others, and that's a consideration for you and your colleagues as well.
So let's go to the question of the tax cuts, because that is one of the key issues Congress will confront when we return. As I analyze the results of your work, it is that although they are pretty modest with respect to bang for the buck, extension of the tax cuts would be positive in the short term, 2011 and 2012, but actually be negative in the long term. That is, permanent extension of the tax cuts, all of them, would actually be the most negative in terms of its effect on economic growth in the long term. Is that correct?
So as you know, we haven't looked at all of these options over the longer term, but of the tax options that we study, the 4 different ways of extending the expiring tax provisions, the permanent extensions would have the largest negative effect on national income over the longer run. The largest boost in the short run, as you said, but the largest negative effect in the long run. And that would occur because the extra government borrowing from the significantly larger deficits would drag down income more than the extra work effort or saving that would be generated by the lower tax rates.
So the effect of tax cuts, which many of us associate as being positive with respect to economic growth, is your conclusion is, in the short term, additional tax cuts, extending the tax cuts, the expiring provisions, would be positive, although the least positive of the policies that you've looked at in terms of effect on the economy. It'd give us the least bang for the buck. But longer term, the tax cuts are actually harmful to economic growth because they're deficit financed. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
So that really creates a conundrum, because we have 2 things that kind of work against each other here. On the one hand, we've got a series of policies that have been rated in terms of bang for the buck. Extending the tax cuts is among the weakest in terms of helping boost economic growth, although it is positive. So extending tax cuts would have a mildly positive effect short term, but it would have a negative effect long term because they're deficit financed. Just as additional spending would help us short term, but be negative long term.
Yes, that's right. The effects are really rather symmetric in that way. We've written this on a number of occasions, that the sorts of policies that lead to short-term boosts, higher government spending or lower taxes, if not accompanied by other offsetting changes over time, if just allowed to increase deficits and debt over time, will have negative effects in the medium and long run.
Let me just say, for many people, it is counterintuitive that tax cuts could somehow hurt future economic growth. How is that? Why is it that in your analysis, tax cuts could be actually harmful to long-term economic growth?
So I think the natural intuition is people thinking about their own situations and thinking correctly that if their rates were lower, that would give them an incentive to work more, to save more, to invest more. And that is right as far as it goes. The problem is that if those tax cuts are not accompanied by other changes in the government budget and are simply funded through borrowing, that borrowing crowds out other private investment in productive capital, in the sorts of equipment, the computers, the machinery, the buildings that are the source of long-term economic growth. And that connection is less visible, and I think thus is less apparent in most people's intuition. But it is no less important for being not so visible, for being more indirect.
Well, I think it's an incredibly important testimony that you're giving us here today. I hope people are listening, because what I hear you saying is short-term, anything we do to provide stimulus, whether it's increased spending or additional tax cuts, will give you a short-term boost, but either of them, additional spending over what's projected or additional tax cuts, will actually hurt longer-term economic growth, because the impact of the deficits and debt will serve like a weight around the neck of the economic engine of this country. Well, I thank you very much for that testimony. I think I hope people are paying attention.